Today's episode is going to be about 10 scenes right out of the Gospels that I've never seen in any Jesus movie. If I'm wrong and you have seen one of these scenes in a movie, put it in the comments below because I'd like to see it. Anyway, let's get started. Number one, this comes out of the Gospel of Mark in chapter 3. This is immediately after he chooses his 12 apostles. He goes into this house and there's a large crowd there. There's so many people gathering around they can't eat their meal. And the next thing you know, he's babbling or he's doing something. Anyway, it draws attention to his family, and his family comes to get him, and they think that he's mad or crazy or insane. And I've never seen this portrayed in any Jesus movie, and I think it would add like a different flavor. Let's see, scene number 2. Jesus doesn't wash his grubby mittens before he sits down to dinner. He goes around spitting on his dirty fingers all day, sticking them in people's mouths and ears and eyes and everything, trying to heal them of their diseases. And then he doesn't wash his hands before his meal. Now, I'm not familiar with all 613 Jewish mitzvahs or commandments, but we can be sure that washing your hands is probably among them. So in chapter 7, the Pharisees notice that Jesus doesn't wash his hands, and when he questions this, gentle Jesus, meek and mild, instead of taking the time to answer patiently and kindly, Jesus calls them hypocrites, and he goes into this tirade about how it's not what goes into your mouth that defiles you, but what comes out of it. Right after this scene, Jesus and his disciples go to a house, and as usual, the disciples are like, Jesus, we don't know what you're talking about. And Jesus, the great teacher, he yells at them and rebukes them too. He's like, what, are you guys dull? Basically, he's pretty much calling his disciples stupid. And it's like, well, he's the one that chose them. Mark 7, verse 33. This is pretty sick. Jesus spits on his fingers, and then he touches this man's tongue, who's mute. I don't know about you, but if some guy with dirty fingers comes up to me and wants to spit in my mouth, I'd be kind of like, I'm good. Chapter 8, verse 23, we have Jesus spitting in a blind man's eyes and that makes me wonder where Jesus is getting all this spit. I mean, at one point he's making little mud balls to rub in this guy's eyes, and is it Bartimaeus? I can't remember. Anyway, one of the blind people, he rubs mud and spit in the guy's eyes, and then in the movie the guy's like, no, get the hell away from me. Oh. But you don't see that in the gospel. It's not written in the gospel, so they kind of embellish on it. The scenes that I'm pointing out to you don't really need too much embellishment at all. They're just kind of weird enough the way they are. But anyway, so he's got to get a lot of spit going because the crowds are gathering on him at some times, and he's healing all these people. He's going to be spitting in this hand and that hand, spitting in this ear and that nose, and this guy's mouth, ears, and whatever, and then he's going to go home and eat his meal. And this is the best part right here. Chapter 13, this is in John's Gospel, his version of the Last Supper. Jesus washes everybody's feet. Again, I'd be like, my feet are fine just the way they are. I don't need any dirty, spitty, disgusting, disease-ridden fingers touching my feet before I eat. But anyway, Jesus washes everyone's feet, and then he goes up and sits down at the table and says, one of you guys is going to betray me. Of course, he knows who it is. Judas knows who it is. And the guy next to him is like, hey, ask Jesus who's going to betray him. And he says, whoever eats this bread that I dip with my dirty fingers is the one that's going to betray me. And he hands it to Judas. He's like, here you go, Judas. And Judas is probably like, no, I'm fine. I'm good. He's like, eat the bread, Judas. Scene number 3. The second feeding of the multitudes. This story, the feeding of the multitudes, is found in all the Gospels, but the second feeding is only found in Mark and Matthew. The authors of Luke and John were smart enough to take this out because all it does is continue on the theme of making the disciples look like a bunch of morons that are about as smart as a second coat of paint. For example, in chapter 6, about verse 37, from that point onward, we have this scene where they got a few fish and a few loaves of bread, and Jesus says, hey, give them something to eat. And the disciples said, where are we going to get the money to feed all these people? And Jesus takes what little they have, and he magically feeds 5,000 men. Of course, this number is pumped up just a little bit for Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, when he redoes it. He says 5,000 men, and plus men and women and children. Just a few days later in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, We have another situation where there's a large crowd of people, not enough food to eat, and Jesus is worried because there's no food. And his disciples, in chapter 8, verse 4, I kid you not, they say, where in this remote place can anyone get bread to feed them? Jesus is probably like, where have you been? Don't you remember just a couple days ago when I fed the 5,000 plus women and children? And they're like, geez, I don't remember that. The first story originally came from the Old Testament. It's a ripoff from 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 42, where a man comes in with 20 loaves of barley. They sit down, they got 100 men to feed, and Elisha says, give it to them to eat, and we'll have some left over. And of course, it's the same verbiage and story plot as the feeding of the multitudes and the refeeding of the multitudes from the Gospels. Number 4, at some point Jesus gave his disciples the powers to cast out demons and heal people. I don't know if this is a good idea. At one point there's a demon that his disciples couldn't cast out in Matthew chapter 17 verse 20, and they asked Jesus, hey, how come we couldn't use our special magic powers you gave us to get rid of this demon? And he says, oh, you didn't have enough faith. But in the original version of this story, in Gospel of Mark, when they ask him this, he says, there are some demons that can only be cast out of prayer. So that makes me wonder, so there's different kinds of demons. What's the difference between a demon that can be cast out by faith and one that can be cast out by prayer? And how do you tell the difference? Is there like a demon school you have to go to learn these things? And you know, apparently back then anybody can, with the right mojo and education, can cast out demons. Because in Luke 9:49, the disciples tell Jesus someone from another gang's over there casting out Jesus, and Jesus is like, nah, it's all right. He ain't hurt nothing. There's plenty of demons. You know, he's not against you, so that means he's for you. Scene number 5, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verse 54. At some point, Jesus is heading back to Jerusalem. He sends messengers ahead to get things ready for him into this Samaritan village. They don't want him there. They don't welcome him. They're like, get out. Take your dirty fingers and your BS and your magical powers and whatever, get out. We don't want it. And so his two of his disciples, James and John, they go up to Jesus and they say, Jesus, do you want us to use our special magical powers you gave us so we can call fire down from heaven and destroy them? So here's these guys that Jesus handpicks to spread his message of love and peace and forgiveness, and they ask Jesus if they can destroy the town with fire and burn people to death simply because they don't want them there. Scene number 6. This is how I would direct my version of the Jesus movie of the Last Supper. We're looking at Gospel of John chapter 13 again. We have Jesus coming up with a new commandment to love each other as I have loved you, he says. And then Simon Peter, the rock, his right-hand man, he says, Lord, where are you going? It's a direct question. By this time, I'm sure Jesus is exasperated at trying to explain these things to his dullard disciples, and he tells Simon, look, where I'm going, you can't follow me. Chapter 14, doubting Thomas asked Jesus, Lord, we don't know where you're going. How can we know the way? Jesus ignores the question again. And he reminds his disciples that you're my friends only if you do what I command. So much for unconditional love. By the time we get to chapter 16, verse 5, Jesus says, now I'm going to go away to him who sent me, and none of you guys ask me where I'm going. And the disciples, in my Jesus movie at this point, I'd have the disciples kind of looking nervously at each other going, well, we just asked him, where are we going? How could, wondering if is this a trick or a trap? Is Jesus trying to set him up so he can tell another one of his parables or stories or something like that? And one of them hesitantly raises his hand. He says, but great teacher, don't you remember Simon Peter just asked you where you're going? And Thomas reiterated, how can we know if you don't tell us where you're going? And in this scene of my Jesus movie, it ends in chapter 16, where after 3 years of traveling around, trying to confuse people so they'll go to hell, Jesus says in John chapter 16, you know what, I'm going to stop talking in all these metaphors and parables. I'm just going to start talking plainly from now on. Everybody kind of breathes a sigh of relief, and his disciples patronizing to say, okay, well, now we see that you know everything. You don't need to know anybody ask you any questions, and that's why we think you're God, or from God. Scene number 7. This has got to be my all-time favorite passage of the 4 Gospels. It's also one of the stupidest things probably ever written, believed by billions of people. Matthew chapter 27, starting at verse 51. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the curtain of the temple was ripped, torn from top to bottom, and the bodies of many holy people who had died were raised back to life. Really? No historians thought this was important enough to mention in any of their books or anything. Not even the other Gospels authors mention that. All these things are certainly very believable, of course, but what makes it absolutely stupid is that this incident takes place on a Friday night, right, after Jesus' crucifixion and lay him in the tomb and all that. These reanimated corpses are brought back to life, but they sit around and they play tic-tac-toe all day Sabbath, waiting for Jesus to be risen on Sunday so they can come out of their tombs. One risen zombie is probably asking, hey, why didn't they just wait till Sunday to bring us back to life? Yeah, that's a good question. So anyway, they sit in their tombs playing games, talking to each other, asking each other, so what do you plan to do when you get out of here? I don't know, maybe do some fishing, go back to work or something, visit friends if any are still alive. How long have you been dead? One of the newly risen saints would probably ask the other one, only a couple years, how about you? Well, I've been dead like 20 years. You know, I got nowhere to go when I get out, nothing to do. So Sunday morning, Jesus is risen, the saints are allowed to come out of their tombs finally, go into the holy city, and appear to a bunch of people. And then what? We never hear anything more about that. You know, they could have really put some more thought into this, have a scene where one of the dead risen holy men brings the other guy back home for dinner, and they set a place for him at the table. And they could do like an offshoot, kind of a reality show about the risen holy saints trying to get their old jobs back and going to their families, and they're being discriminated against because of their reanimated status. Anyway, I'm just babbling now. Scene 8, chapter 24. This is in Luke. This is also one of my all-time favorite scenes from the Gospels. This is after Jesus is risen from the dead, and he suddenly just appears in the home of the disciples, and they stand there in awe looking at him. And I swear, I kid you not, I'm not making this up, you can look it up for yourself. Jesus asked them, hey, you guys got anything to eat? And they're kind of like, yeah, I think we got some broiled fish here. And Jesus is like, gee, thanks, and he eats it. Then he go outside, and they get sucked up into heaven, and that's the end of the story. Scene number 9. Jesus goes up to this fig tree knowing it's out of season, looking for fruit, and he curses it when it doesn't have any fruit, of course, and it withers and dies. Of course, in Matthew's remake, this is the remake of it, because in Mark, the original version in Mark's gospel, it takes a little longer for the fig tree to die. In Mark, his curse didn't have all the same fast-acting fig tree-killing formula they have in the Gospel of Matthew, which is so much better that even Roundup formula can't compete with it, because that takes like 3 hours to kick in. With Jesus' formula in Matthew, it's like, you know, as soon as he curses it, you see some results there. And finally, scene number 10, the Sermon on the Mount. Who's writing all this stuff down? You? Did you bring a pen? I forgot to bring it. I didn't bring it. You got something to write with? I don't know. I'm trying to keep up with Jesus. How did this happen? Who wrote all this stuff down? Every time I watch a movie, Jesus talking, whether it's Sermon on the Mount or anything else, I never see anybody with a pen and a pad of paper writing this stuff down. And I wonder, you know, one author proposed that the Apostle Matthew, who was a tax collector, would have been able to write shorthand. They must have had some sort of Aramaic shorthand, so he'd be able to keep up with Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And again, of course, this is all very believable, but it doesn't necessarily explain who's writing down the conversations that Jesus is having between Pontius Pilate and himself. After he gets arrested, you know, he's behind closed doors, and the Pontius Pilate's like, are you who you say you are? And he's not giving a firm commitment. He's like, well, you say I am. Yeah, all right. Anyway, maybe he told them on the way out, or when he's dying on the cross or something, he said, hey, by the way, when I was in there talking to Pilate, he said this, and I was like that. And, you know, this is probably the same thing for Jesus when he went out in the wilderness with the devil, and he's talking, and his devil's like, hey, why don't you throw yourself down if you're the Son of God? Nobody was up there with him, so who's writing all this down? Jesus would have had to came back down and said, so I'm like this, and Satan's kind of like that, and I told him this, and then I went back out of there because I was hungry. Anyway, so I hope you enjoyed watching this. Happy Easter!